The ranch had been quiet for decades. It sat at the edge of pine forest and golden plains, where fences weren't just wood and wire. They were boundaries between worlds. When the new luxury HOA community moved in next door, they called the forest scenic property value. They didn't call it protected
Look over
land.
there, isn't it
They didn't
beautiful?
call
It
it
really is.
wildlife
Let's go take a look.
territory.
I think that's the
And
best
they
spot.
definitely
I
didn't
agree.
call it a conservation buffer zone. But one afternoon, when Karen Whitmore stepped over a private fence with a clipboard in her hand and a complaint on her lips, she had no idea she wasn't stepping onto empty land. She was stepping into something far bigger than a neighborhood dispute. And the ranch owner? He wasn't worried about her complaints. He was worried about what she might attract. The Mercer Ranch did not look impressive from the paved road. It didn't have a gate with stone pillars. It didn't have a fountain. It didn't have manicured hedges cut into decorative spirals. It had weathered fencing, open pasture, and forest that began without warning. Daniel Mercer stood at the fence line most mornings before sunrise. He didn't need an alarm. The wind through pine needles had replaced that years ago. He had grown up here. His father had grown up here. His grandfather built the first barn by hand. The ranch wasn't profitable in the way developers measured profit, but it had never once asked permission to exist. That changed when Silver Pines Estates was built next door. Where there had once been rolling scrubland, now there were uniform houses with identical mailboxes, white fencing, curated landscaping, a sign at the entrance that read, Silver Pines Estates, where nature meets luxury. Daniel had noticed the irony, because nature was already here.
And it didn't need luxury.
Introduce Karen Whitmore. Karen Whitmore did not see herself as unreasonable. She saw herself as necessary. As president of the Silver Pines HOA, she believed her role was to protect investment, order, presentation. She noticed Daniel's ranch the way someone notices a stain on a white shirt. The fencing looked aged. The warning signs along the back tree line read, Wildlife Transition Corridor, do not enter beyond this point. To Karen, those signs felt dramatic, possibly fabricated. She stood at the neighborhood edge one afternoon and told another board member, He's trying to scare buyers. I guarantee there are no bears back there. But Daniel had placed those signs for a reason. The ranch bordered a state-designated wildlife buffer zone connected to a regional conservation network. Seasonal migration passed quietly along that tree line every year. It had been that way longer than Silver Pines had existed. Emotional grounding. At night, Daniel sometimes walked to the forest edge and stood still. His late wife, Emily, had once volunteered with wildlife rehabilitation programs. She believed coexistence was possible if humans stayed humble. After she passed, Daniel protected that buffer zone more fiercely. Not out of fear, out of memory. The first official notice. One afternoon, Daniel found an envelope pinned to his fence. Formal complaint, property aesthetic violation. He wasn't part of the HOA. He had never signed anything. Yet Karen had mailed 3 warnings claiming his fencing was visually deteriorated. His livestock were too visible from HOA lots. His wildlife signs created an atmosphere of danger. Daniel folded the letter slowly, then placed it in a kitchen drawer without reacting. Silence unsettled Karen more than confrontation. At the next HOA meeting, Karen tapped her clipboard. If he refuses cooperation, we will document it ourselves. The room nodded. Outside that evening, wind moved through the pine line. And deep within the trees, something large shifted quietly. Not threatening, just present. Fade to black. Karen escalated. She hired a private surveyor. She requested property line verification. She insisted Daniel's warning markers extended too close to HOA property. The surveyor returned with something unexpected. The ranch did not encroach on the HOA. The HOA sat directly beside a protected conservation corridor registered with the state. Karen dismissed it. If it was that serious, someone would have told us before we built. But disclosures had been buried in development paperwork. Not highlighted. Not emphasized. The first trespass. One bright afternoon, Karen decided documentation was necessary. She walked along the fence with her phone recording. "This is clearly exaggerated signage," she narrated. She stepped over a low section of fencing where pasture met tree line. She didn't hear Daniel approach. He stood 50 yards away, watching calmly.
He didn't yell.
He didn't accuse.
He simply watched the forest.
Because he knew something Karen did not. The corridor was seasonal. And this was the season. The forest grew unnaturally still. Birdsong faded. Karen hesitated for just a moment, then laughed nervously and stepped back over the fence. She told herself she imagined the silence. Daniel said nothing. But that night, he made a phone call to the regional wildlife office. Not to report Karen. To alert them. Karen posted photos in the HOA group. Clearly no wildlife. Just intimidation tactics. The comments were divided. Some agreed. Some felt uneasy. And somewhere in the trees, a quiet pattern shifted. Karen returned days later. This time with 2 board members. And confidence. They stepped beyond the marker signs, deeper into the corridor edge, filming. Daniel didn't confront them. He called the state wildlife authority directly. Within 30 minutes, a state wildlife officer vehicle arrived. The officer was calm, professional, but firm. This is a monitored migration buffer. Unauthorized entry can disrupt seasonal patterns. Karen's composure cracked slightly. "We're just inspecting adjacent property concerns." The officer replied, "This land predates your development. The buffer status is registered. You were required to disclose adjacency during sales." The implication landed heavily. Not on Daniel. On the HOA. Neighbors began to watch from a distance. Whispers spread quickly. No dramatic encounter occurred. But something far more powerful did. Authority shifted. Karen was no longer the highest voice in the situation. Public shift. A local environmental blogger posted an article. New development pressures established wildlife corridor. Comments poured in. Residents began asking questions at HOA meetings. Why weren't we informed clearly? Could this affect property value? Karen insisted Daniel was exaggerating. But records showed annual wildlife filings signed by him. Documented. Consistent. Respectful. By the end of Part 3, doubt had entered Silver Pines. And doubt is louder than anger. Emergency, HOA meeting. Tension filled the clubhouse. Residents argued, not with hostility, but with anxiety. Karen insisted she was protecting the community. But board members began distancing themselves. A homeowner stood and asked, "Did we move into their environment?" Silence followed. Daniel attended one meeting quietly. He spoke only once. "I've never asked you to leave. I've only asked you not to push." The simplicity of that statement shifted the room. Later, financial concerns emerged. Environmental compliance risks. Disclosure concerns. Potential liability if residents crossed buffer zones. Karen's authority began dissolving. A vote was called for temporary suspension pending review.
It passed.
Not unanimously, but clearly. Karen left that meeting visibly shaken. Not defeated, but confronted by reality. Months passed. The tension cooled. The HOA installed clear signage acknowledging the conservation boundary. Residents attended a wildlife awareness session hosted by the state officer. Daniel allowed supervised educational tours along the ranch fence, never crossing the buffer, just learning about it. Children became curious instead of fearful. One family approached Daniel privately. "We didn't know. We're sorry." He nodded. "That's all I ever wanted." Karen eventually moved from Silver Pines. Not disgraced. Not destroyed. Just no longer in control. Early morning. Mist rising over pasture. Daniel stands at the fence line. In the distance, a bear and cub move along the forest edge.
Calm.
Unbothered. Undisturbed. The HOA homes sit quiet.
Still.
Respectful. The land remains what it always was. And for the first time since Silver Pines was built, so does the boundary. Fade out.